Hey there, all you gorgeous guys and dolls! Welcome back to Broadway by Ghostlight. I'm Mark Bonanni, and today is the second lesson in our Broadway 101 series, taking a brief overview of some of the important people, places, shows, and lore from the history of musical theater. Today's lesson class is on a man whose music has embedded itself into our collective culture, and whose musicals have not only stood the test of time, but are considered some of the best ever written. A Tony, Oscar, Grammy, and Pulitzer Prize winner, and one of a handful of creatives to find success writing both music and lyrics. Open your books, students, to the Musical Masters chapter, and let's take a look at the life of Frank Loesser. Frank Henry Loesser was born in 1910 in Manhattan's Upper West Side. His father Henry was a full-time piano teacher, and yet he never taught his youngest son to play. Instead, Frank had an inherent gift for music, and by the age of 4 had the ability to play anything simply by ear. Frank's father, his mother Julia, and his older half-brother Arthur were all great admirers and students of classical music and openly abhorred current popular tunes. So naturally, Frank, ever the rebel, was drawn to modern music, writing his own starting at a young age. Though Frank was a bright and witty young man, school proved to be difficult for him. After he was expelled from Townsend Harris High School, Frank briefly attended CCNY, the City College of New York, until he was expelled from that school as well for failing every class but English and PE. When Frank was 16, his father died unexpectedly, and he had to take on a myriad of jobs to help support himself and his family. At different points, Frank Loesser was an ad salesman, a restaurant critic, a political cartoonist, a vaudeville comedy sketch writer, an editor for Women's Wear Daily, a film studio press rep, and a process server. Though Loesser's resume was on the chaotic side, the one constant in his life was his music. When Frank Loesser was looking to break into the songwriting business, he worked primarily as a lyricist. His first published song came in 1931 titled In Love with the Memory of You, with music by William Schumann. Other early Loesser songs from the early 1930s included I Wish I Were Twins,
I wish that I were twins, you great big baby king, so I could love you twice as much as I do.
and Junkman, both with music and lyrics by Joe Mayer, the latter of which was recorded by Mildred Bailey and the Benny Goodman Orchestra.
I'm gonna give that junk man my broken heart, the broken heart I got from you. I'm gonna give that junk man my broken heart for a loaded 32.
Around 1935, Loesser began working at a nightclub called The Backdrop, which was located on East 52nd Street, where he would perform some of his original songs along with his music writing partner at the time, Irving Achtman. Two significant things in Frank's life came out of his time at The Backdrop. The first came about when a Broadway producer was in the audience one night at The Backdrop when Frank and Irving were performing, and he liked their stuff enough to hire the team to write songs for their first Broadway musical, a revue titled The Illustrator Show, which only ended up running 5 performances, but it did give Loesser a taste of Broadway. The other, slightly more lasting thing to come out of his time at The Backdrop was meeting a singer there named Lynn Garland. The pair fell in love, and Frank and Lynn were married in 1936. Though The Illustrator Show wasn't successful, the music of Achtman and Loesser did get some good notices in the press, which caught the attention of a Hollywood scout, who brought the pair out to California to write songs for Universal Pictures. Though once out on the West Coast, the newly married Frank was soon swept up by Paramount Pictures, which in 1937 offered him a contract that would last until 1949. It's during this pre-war time in Hollywood that Loesser began working with some of the biggest names in the music writing world at the time, and he starts to have some lasting hits. A few of the highlights from this era of Loesser are See What the Boys in the Back Room Will Have, with music by Friedrich Hollander, which was sung by Marlene Dietrich in Destry Rides Again from 1939.
What the boys in the back room will have, and tell them I'm having the same. Go see what the boys in the back room will have, and give them the poison they name.
The song Two Sleepy People, written with Hoagy Carmichael for the film Thanks for the Memory from 1938 with Bob Hope.
Here we are, out of cigarettes holding hands and yawning. Look how late it gets.
Two sleepy people with nothing to say, and too much in love to break away.
The song Jingle Jangle Jingle, written with Joseph Lilly for the film The Forest Rangers, voted as one of the top 100 Western songs of all time by the Western Writers of America in 2010.
I got spurs that jingle, jangle, jingle, as I go riding merrily along. And they sing, oh, ain't you glad to single? And that song ain't so very far from wrong.
And in 1939, also with Hoagy Carmichael, Frank Loesser wrote this eternal classic for a short film called A Song Is Born, starring singer B. Wayne and the Larry Clinton Orchestra.
Heart and soul, I fell in love with you, heart and soul, the way a fool would do madly, because you held me tight and stole a kiss in the night.
When America finally entered World War II, Frank enrolled in the United States Air Force, where he did what he did best, writing songs, now for the US military to help with the wartime efforts. His biggest wartime hit was the song Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition, which sold 550,000 copies of its sheet music.
Down went the gunner, a bullet was his fate. Down went the gunner, and then the gunner's mate. Up jumped the sky pilot, gave the boys a look, and manned the gun himself as he laid aside his book.
Shouting, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition, and we'll all stay free.
He still worked in the film industry during this time too, writing songs for dozens of movies, and after being discharged from the military, Loesser would return to Hollywood. It was around this time that Frank began writing less and less with other collaborators and starts to write most of his own music as well at the encouragement of his wife Lynn. Frank would, when writing lyrics only, come up with a dummy tune, a sort of melody meant to not be in the final song, just something to simply hang the lyrics on, so to speak. But Lynn stated that oftentimes, after a composer had written the melody for a song with Frank's lyrics, she almost always preferred the original dummy tune, and so encouraged her husband to write both music and lyrics. Loesser continued to have success in Hollywood throughout the 1940s, being nominated several times for the Academy Award for Best Song. The number that finally won him the Oscar has gone on to be a classic song recorded by dozens of the best singers throughout the years. However, it almost cost him his marriage. Back in 1944, Loesser wrote a song exclusively for his wife Lynn and himself to be performed at parties. The fun and flirty duet caught on like wildfire, and soon the Loessers were being invited to every major party in the country simply so they would perform their song. Here are the actual voices of Frank and Lynn Loesser singing their special song, which I'm sure you'll recognize.
Hey baby, where you going?
I really can't
But
stay.
baby, it's cold outside.
I've got to go
But
away.
baby, it's cold outside.
This evening has
So
been
happy that you dropped
so
in.
very nice.
I'll hold your hands. They're just like
My
ice.
mother will.
Movie studios begged Frank to sell them Baby It's Cold Outside for use in a film, and he finally relented in 1949 and sold the song to MGM for use in the movie Neptune's Daughter.
I ought to say no, no,
Mind if I
senor.
move in
At
close?
least I'm going to say that I tried.
What's the sense of hurting my
I
pride?
really can't
Oh,
stay.
baby, don't hold out,
Oh,
baby.
but it's cold outside.
Lynn Loesser was devastated that her song, one that she dearly loved, was taken from her, as she felt, and sent out into the world, and the first signs of cracks in their happy marriage began to show. By the late 1940s, Frank Loesser was beginning to feel stale in Hollywood. He wanted more opportunities to write what he wanted, and what he really wanted to do was write a complete score, end to end, all by himself. Luckily for Frank and the world, the opportunity quickly came when Cy Feuer and Ernie Martin entered his life. In 1947, Cy Feuer, a fellow film music maker, decided that he had no real talent for film scoring and left LA for New York, where he teamed up with his friend Ernest Martin, then the head of comedy programming for CBS Radio, to produce Broadway musicals. The pair had secured the rights to the 1892 play Charlie's Aunt by Brandon Thomas and asked Loesser to write the score. The resulting musical was Where's Charlie?, which opened on Broadway at the St. James Theatre on October 11th, 1948, directed by George Abbott, who also wrote the book, and choreographed by George Balanchine. It starred Ray Bolger, most famous for playing the Scarecrow in the film The Wizard of Oz, as Charlie Wickham, a university student desperate for some alone time with his girlfriend. Through various failed plans and shenanigans, Charlie must also pretend to be his elderly aunt. Of course, complications ensue with lots of fast-paced costume changing. Think Mrs. Doubtfire and the restaurant scene. The musical received fairly poor reviews, with the best of them calling the show a, quote, sublimely satisfactory evening, though Loesser's music did receive better notices than the show as a whole. Luckily for all involved, the musical and particularly the score did have two big fans that made a big difference: Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein II. The musical theater legends loved Where's Charlie and let everyone know it, even allowing quotes from the duo to appear in advertising for the musical. Word of mouth quickly spread, and Where's Charlie ended up running for 2 years. The most popular song from the show has to be Once in Love with Amy, a song which followed Ray Bolger for the rest of his life.
Ray, that lady down there would like to hear you sing Once in Love with Amy. Do you remember the words?
You kidding? I'll never forget this song because it's my favorite. Once in love with Amy.
Always in love with Amy. Ever and ever fascinated by her. Set your heart afire to stay.
Sadly, due to a drawn-out musician strike at the time, an original cast recording was never made. This, coupled with the fact that the film version of Where's Charlie, with several of the original cast intact, including Bolger, is extremely hard to find, and that has unfortunately pushed Where's Charlie into obscurity. Buoyed by their success, Fuhrer and Martin made the wise decision to stick with Frank Loesser for their next planned musical. And while Where's Charlie had been a modest success, the next musical from the trio would not only prove to be a smash hit, but would go on to be considered one of the greatest musical comedies ever written.
I got the horse right here, the name is Paul Revere, and here's a guy that says if the weather's clear, can do. This guy says the horse can do. If he says the horse can do.
Guys and Dolls opened on Broadway at the 46th Street Theatre, now called the Richard Rodgers Theatre, on November 24th, 1950. Based on various short stories by Damon Runyon, the musical boasted a brilliant book by Abe Burrows, direction by George S. Kaufman, and choreography by Michael Kidd. Now, as I mentioned before in the previous video on Ethel Merman, I'm not going to dive in too much into the actual musical themselves in these videos, because the shows, especially major ones like Guys and Dolls, really deserve to have their own devoted video in the future, so keep that in mind as we proceed. But suffice to say that Guys and Dolls made all of America at the time hum some tunes by Frank Loesser. Guys and Dolls would win 5 trophies at the 5th Annual Tony Awards, including Best Musical and Best Score for Frank. A major film adaptation happened in 1955 starring Vivian Blaine, Gene Simmons, Frank Sinatra, and Marlon Brando. Little fun fact about the Guys and Dolls film, Marlon Brando agreed to the role only if assured he could do his own singing, which is wild since Brando had never previously sung before. Loesser took the time though to personally teach each and every song to Brando, sometimes note by painstaking note. Marlon Brando was a piece of cake for Loesser though compared to Frank Sinatra in the film. Loesser was famously a huge stickler for his music being sung exactly as written, while Sinatra always insisted on singing every song in his own way. The pair fought furiously on the set, and after filming wrapped, Sinatra vowed to never sing a Frank Loesser song again, banning them from his recordings and concerts, though Sinatra did break this rule a couple of times over his career. After Guys and Dolls, Frank briefly headed back to Hollywood, where he wrote the score for the 1952 film Hans Christian Andersen, starring Danny Kaye, in a much fictionalized story of the famous fairy tale writer. The charming movie musical had some lasting hits from Loesser, including Inchworm,
Inchworm, inchworm, measuring the There he goes.
Thumbelina.
No, 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 come, come, come.
Thumbelina, Thumbelina, tiny little thing. Thumbelina dance, Thumbelina sing.
And the song most likely to be stuck in your head for months at a time, Wonderful Copenhagen.
To wonderful, wonderful Copenhagen, salty old queen of the sea.
After completing Hans Christian Andersen, Loesser was looking for his next Broadway musical. A friend gave him the 1924 play They Knew What They Wanted for a possible musical adaptation, and Frank fell in love with the story, devoting the next 4 years to the piece, his most ambitious project ever. The musical was The Most Happy Fella, which opened at the Imperial Theater on May 3rd, 1956. The Most Happy Fella follows Tony Esposito, an older Italian immigrant and wealthy grape farmer who secretly falls in love with a waitress he calls Rosabella. Though she has never seen him, the pair begin a love affair via mail, and Rosabella even agrees to marry Tony and move to Napa, California, where he lives. The problem is that when she wrote to him and asked him for a picture, Tony, believing himself to be too old and unattractive for a woman to fall in love with, sent her a photo of his young, attractive farmhand named Joe instead, and once Rosabella moves in, a love triangle forms. In addition to writing the complete score for The Most Happy Fella, Frank Loesser was also the book writer for the show. With only about 15 minutes of spoken dialogue, the 3-act musical has been deemed by many scholars, critics, and music lovers as an operetta or even a full-blown opera. Much of the beautiful score is grand and sweeping and certainly evokes an opera. Though the secondary romantic plot of the show between another farmhand named Herman
Standing on the corner, watching all the girls go by,
and Rosabella's friend and fellow waitress Cleo is pure musical comedy.
Ooh, my feet, my poor, poor feet. Bet you your life a waitress earns her pay.
Frank Loesser himself certainly never classified The Most Happy Fella as an opera or operetta. He always asserted that it was just a musical with a lot of music. One of the lead producers of The Most Happy Fella was Lynn Loesser, Frank's wife. While auditioning performers for the leading roles, one actress caught her eye and she sent her over to meet Frank, certain he would like her for one of the leading roles. And like her, he did. Not only did Frank cast Joe Sullivan in the leading role of Rosabella, but the pair instantly fell madly in love with each other. Both Frank and Joe would divorce their current spouses, and the pair were married in 1959. After dealing with the magnificent and massive with The Most Happy Fella, for his next project, Loesser wanted something simple and small. Green Willow opened at the Alvin Theater, now called the Neil Simon Theater, on March 8, 1960. The musical is about Gideon Briggs, who lives in the fantasy town of Green Willow. In the show, each Briggs man is destined to follow the, quote, call to wander, and always end up leaving their wives and children behind. Gideon loves his girlfriend Dory, but fears he won't be able to resist the call to wander himself. When a newcomer to town arrives named Reverend Birdsong, Gideon enlists his help to break the family curse. Leading the show in the role of Gideon was Anthony Perkins, who was actually filming the horror classic Psycho at the same time as rehearsing Green Willow, with the actor having to fly from coast to coast multiple times a week. Green Willow ended up receiving very mixed reviews when it opened. The New York Times called the show an enchanted fable with an ideal libretto, while another critic called the show hopelessly stodgy and a lost cause. Green Willow would receive 7 Tony nominations for the 1960 Tony Awards, though winning none, and the score did have one breakout hit, the song Never Will I Marry, which has been recorded by the likes of Barbra Streisand, Nancy Wilson, Linda Ronstadt, and Judy Garland.
Never, never will I marry. Never, never will I wed.
Ultimately, though, Green Willow proved to be Frank Loesser's first flop, closing 2 months after opening. Frank Loesser wasn't down for the count, though, and the musical master would bounce back in a big way with his next musical, because if there's one thing Frank Loesser knew how to do, it was how to succeed.
How to apply for a job, how to advance from the mailroom, how to sit down at a desk. This book is all that I need. how to succeed.
When producers Cy Fier and Ernie Martin acquired the rights to the best-selling satirical book How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, they decided to reunite the Boffo team from Guys and Dolls of Loesser and book writer Abe Burrows. Burrows would direct the musical as well, with Bob Fosse providing the choreography. How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying opened on October 15, 1961 at the 46th Street Theater, the very same theater where Guys and Dolls had opened 9 years prior. The musical starred Robert Morse as J. Pierpont Finch, who begins the show as a window washer, and using his trusty new book bearing the show's title, he speed races up the corporate ladder of the Worldwide Wicked Company. Starring alongside Morse was Rudy Vallee as Big Boss J.B. Bigley, Bonnie Scott as his love interest Rosemary, and Charles Nelson Riley as Bud Frump, the annoying Nepo nephew also trying to rise through the ranks. How to Succeed was a brilliant satirical comedy that won not only the Best Musical Tony, but the Pulitzer Prize for Drama as well. The musical would eventually close on March 6, 1965, after 1,417 performances. A wonderful film version of the show with Morris and Vallee intact would be released in 1967. Sadly, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying would end up being the final new musical written by Frank Loesser to reach Broadway. In 1965, Loesser had a new musical aiming for Broadway called Pleasures and Palaces. It was a comedic account of the actual historical events in which American Revolutionary War hero John Paul Jones entered into the services of the Empress of Russia, and various political and romantic complications ensue. The musical, which was to be both directed and choreographed by Bob Fosse, played its out-of-town tryout in Detroit's Fisher Theater. The critics dismissed the show, with one reviewer calling it lesser, and the theatrical giant agreed, deciding to shut down the show for good before it reached New York. In the late 1960s, Loesser was working on another musical, an adaptation of the short story Senor Discretion himself by Bud Schulberg, which was published in Playboy magazine in 1966. It told the story of 3 bored priests in a sleepy Mexican village who decide to spice things up by fabricating a miracle involving local baker and town drunk Pancito. Loesser had completed a 300-page draft of the book as well as 17 different songs for the show, but it was all for naught. On July 28, 1969, Frank Loesser, a lifelong heavy chain smoker, died of lung cancer at the far too young age of 59. Jo Sullivan Loesser, Frank's widow and fierce guardian of Frank's legacy, revisited Senor Discretion himself much later in life, and a full production of the Lost Loesser musical was performed at the Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. in 2004. It is surprising and sad to think that such an incredible and monumental talent like Frank Loesser's only provided 5 musicals that would reach Broadway. He was once asked why he wasn't able to write more musicals, and Loesser responded with, "I don't write slow, I just throw out fast." Besides the wonderful tunes and witty lyrics from his vast library of songs, there is one aspect of Frank Loesser's contribution to the American musical theater that I haven't mentioned yet, and one that deserves, I think, just as much praise as his musicals, and that is his mentorship. In 1950, after the success of Guys and Dolls, Frank Loesser created 2 theatrical businesses that would prove invaluable. The first was the Frank Music Corporation, a music publishing house, and the second was Musical Theater International, or MTI, which is a theatrical licensing agency. Loesser, as brilliant a businessman as he was a writer, created these businesses not only to control all the sales, publishing, and rights to his songs and musicals, but also to help nurture and guide the next generation of songwriters and showmakers. Frank Loesser would personally mentor each young addition he saw promise in, guiding them not only in their songwriting and show creations, but also the business end of the show business world. Just some of the creators mentored and managed by Frank Loesser were Richard Adler and Jerry Ross, who would write Damn Yankees and The Pajama Game, Meredith Willson, who would write The Music Man and The Unsinkable Molly Brown, and Jerry Herman, who would write Hello Dolly, Mame, and La Cage aux Folles, among others. If you want to dive deeper into the life of Frank Loesser, you do have a few great options. There are 2 biographies written about him. The first is titled A Most Remarkable Fella, Frank Loesser and the Guys and Dolls in His Life, which was written by one of his daughters, Susan Loesser, in 1993. The second, more academic tome is from the Yale Broadway Master series, simply titled Frank Loesser, written by Thomas L. Rees. There is also a new book coming out soon, on August 5th actually, by the wonderful musical theater historian Dominic Broomfield McHugh, called The Letters of Frank Loesser, which paints a picture of the man and artist by compiling for the first time all his correspondence from throughout his life. But if you don't have too much time to read these days, there is a really great documentary titled Heart and Soul: The Life and Music of Frank Loesser, which was released by PBS Video in 2006 with dozens of amazing interviews and rare clips and pictures. Let me know your favorite Frank Loesser show or song in the comments. I'd love to see what you guys think. If you enjoyed this video and maybe learned something today, students, it would truly make me the most happy fella if you would hit that like button and the subscribe button for me as well, so you'll never miss a class. If you want to approach the board and show off how much theater trivia you know, I've got a new episode of Broadway Jeopardy out every Thursday here on the channel. If you want to learn more about a particular star, creator, show, or anything else musical theater history related, be sure to let me know in the comments as well, and I'll be sure to add it to the list of future lesson plans. And of course, my heart and soul belongs to my patrons over on Patreon. I could not keep making these videos without you guys, and you all deserve a bushel and a peck of my gratitude. If you want to help me succeed in the YouTube business while trying really, really hard, you can check out my Patreon using the link in the video description, where there's also a link to my merch shop. Another way to help out the channel is to praise the Lord and pass the recommendations. Oh, these puns are too much. But yes, sharing these videos with anyone who might enjoy it goes a long way to growing this series. You can connect with me outside of the classroom over on Instagram and Blue Sky. But until the next lesson, you beautiful Broadway babies, I'm Mark Benani. This is Broadway by Ghostlight. Class dismissed.